Now I set the ball rolling. I first go to Dr. Makhija. Dr. Makhija, you said that there are resistant hypertension. We decide, and 3 drugs have been used, and the blood pressure goal is still not met. I would like to add that it is to be said resistant hypertension only when maximum doses of 3 drugs have been used. And despite that, the hypertension goal is not achieved. And very well, you rightly pointed out that the office office blood pressure measurement versus the home blood pressure measurement versus the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, all goals are slightly different. It is slightly high for the patients who come to the office of the doctor, and those who are monitoring at home, the blood pressure goal is to be slightly kept low. It is 135 by 85, while in doctor's clinic it is 140 by 80, and at home it is 130 by less than 130 by 80. That's so far true. Dr. Makhija, I would like to ask you one question. At times, our physicians are not able to decide from the clinical signs whether they are dealing with the secondary hypertension, that is one of the secondary causes of the hypertension, or it is the essential hypertension. Can you please enumerate some features, the clinical features by which they can early decide that this is their secondary hypertension and investigate accordingly, particularly the role of obstructive sleep apnea and the primary hyperaldosteronism, which at times go missed because of subtle signs. Dr. Makhija, I just unmute you. Fine.
Day-to-day OPD settings. I'm still there.
Dr. Makhija, you kindly speak.
Yeah. So first thing is on the basis of once you see the patient, you have to decide. One thing very important to rule out is you have to take the history of OSA. Not from the patient, but from his attendants, especially from a spouse, or if there's a female, from the husband. If there's a history of snoring, we think the patient is obese, then OSA is a very common entity which is often missed, and that needs to be investigated through a sleep study. Secondly, if though not sometimes possible in a busy OPD practice, but especially if you're seeing the patient for the first time, especially if it's a young patient, you should try and feel both the upper limb and the lower limb pulsations, and that way you can get an idea. You can sometimes, or maybe if you're careful enough, rule out at least coarctation or some vasculitis, large vessel vasculitis, etc., which are another common cause of secondary hypertension. Thirdly, you have a look at his normal routine profile, the blood investigation, which normally most of the patients do get it done. It's a list of investigations, routine CBC, KFT. KFT is very important. If the patient shows even a mild renal derangement, slight rise in creatinine, or the patient has a persistent hypokalemia, the patient is fluid overloaded, or the patient has sudden repeated episodes of axial hypertension, then we should always rule out the causes, especially secondary hyperaldosteronism, the Cushing's, as well as the pheochromocytoma. These are the things which are often underdiagnosed and missed in the initial settings. And one more thing, which is a clue, that if the patient has even a mild asymmetry of the renal size on ultrasound, or when you start the patient, especially on a AS or an R, and there's a rise in creatinine, these are certain clues that the patient might be having renovascular or a renal parenchymal disease, and one needs to investigate them, because once the patient is labeled as hypertensive, then the patient is going to get the hypertensive medications for the rest of his life. And these are few conditions. If we diagnose them early and treat them, then the patient will be free of hypertension for the rest, at least for a majority of his life.
That's really wonderful. So we have a combination of palpitation, perspiration, pain, and pallor. In case you find that the patient is having hypertension and he's having pallor, and then one must always look for, one must immediately look for the kidney. In case the patient is having palpitation and patient is having headache and perspiration, one may always go towards the diagnosis of febrile hematoma. And if patient is obese, there's a history of snoring, and the hypertension is labile, sometimes going down, sometimes going up, then one has to always look for the obstructive sleep apnea and the auditory study accordingly. And Dr. Makhija, I just wanted to add, you said one of your slides showed that the role of beta blockers in pregnancy. When do we use beta blockers in pregnancy? And before I go to that question, I would like to add that beta blockers, they may have a role in the obstructive sleep apnea cases who have hypertension, because the hypertension and obstructive sleep apnea is because there is sympathetic overstimulation, and beta blockers, they are able to blunt that overstimulation drive. So these patients might be better benefited with the early addition of a beta blocker. And now coming on to the pregnancy with beta blockers, in what conditions do we use beta blockers? I think we use alpha and beta blockers together.
Yeah, we use them together, but beta blockers, otherwise they are considered safe in pregnancy, and they can be used at all stages of pregnancy. Usually the medications are started, if it's a pregnancy-induced hypertension, then it's usually started on second trimester onwards. First trimester, usually it's not a PIH, it's more of the patient has associated hypertension. But the current recommendations are that the blood pressure, the beta blockers can be given at all stages, whether alone or with centrally acting like alpha methyl dopa in pregnancy. And there is some concern that it decreases the fetal movements and might interfere with the uterine contractions, but the long-term data has shown that that is not the case, and it can be used in at all times during the pregnancy.
So it is important that we start the patient with the other drugs other than the ARBs and the ACE inhibitors and the diuretics in pregnancy, and later on we add beta blockers in the last, not in the beginning, and the main choices remain the centrally acting antihypertensive agents. Now I come to Dr. Kunal. Dr. Kunal, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
one of our audience wants to know what is the treatment of choice of for a patient who is having uncontrolled diabetes and who has microalbuminuria in the urine examination.
Patient who has albuminuria, obviously the first choice is choosing an ACE inhibitor or ARB if his BP allows you to do that. As per the diabetic medication, though, after the canagliflozin presented its studies, now it is almost beyond doubt that SGLT2 helps in slowing of this progression of kidney disease, and in some cases, not all, in some cases it might even reverse microalbuminuria, sometimes even macroalbuminuria. So if there is no contraindication to adding an SGLT2, so that should be a preferred diabetic medication to add in these cases. Obviously, you have to rule out SGLT2 is a little tricky drug. So once you rule out the contraindications of giving SGLT2, then it is a choice to add.
And especially when the remigliflozin going to be a slightly less expensive drug and it is more affordable a choice, one can always start with in case it is a class effect. Do you feel that the reduction of microalbuminuria is related to the class effect, or do you feel that it is particularly?
Yes, sir. I was about to point that out. It appears to be a class effect because that is what the other drugs are showing, but specifically remigliflozin has not shown that data. But obviously it is a little early, and I'm sure the data would come up because most of the effects of cardiovascular and renal appear to be a class effect.
That's nice. That's very nice.
More or less, everybody has shown some benefit. So we can expect that, sir.
And I think in case the patient has microalbuminuria, rather than choosing or particularly running after a special drug which might be more expensive, it may be important to emphasize that the patient has to control the diabetes, bring down the HbA1c,
absolutely,
so that the kidney disease in itself gets controlled and does not progress that fast. And now I come on to the lifestyle changes which are nearly common to both the entities, hypertension and diabetes. Arun, can we go on to for about 5 minutes more?
Yeah, sure, sir, sure.
I would like to emphasize upon the lifestyle changes because they are common, and most of the physicians and busy practitioners do not emphasize the lifestyle modification to the patient, and patient, once having paid the consultation, is not interested to listen to the lifestyle modification because it's slightly difficult to adopt and difficult to change. But Corona has told a lot of things to the world. And hypertension and diabetes both are the lifestyle diseases, and both advocate the exercise, the role of exercise, and the exercise is really 30 minutes per day for about 5 days a week. And once somebody does an exercise, it brings down the blood pressure by say 8 to 6 millimeters of mercury, and that effect lasts for about 22 hours. And if the patient is able to repeat the exercise on the next day, then the effect is long lasting. And similarly, the role of diet, everybody wants to know what is the role of diet. Everybody wants to cut down on the sweets in diabetes, but one does not really know what is to be taken. Most important thing to be taken is, this is the plate, this is the concept of plate, and I'm going to show it to my viewers. This is the concept of plate, and this is the way I try to show to all my patients that their plate, 9-inch plate, should carry the vegetables, the cereals, less of dairy products, and mainly the fruits and the whole grains and other things. Similarly, for the patients with hypertension, everybody is after the salt, but nobody is realizing the importance of cutting down the saturated fatty acids, adding on the vegetables, the fruits, and people are just wanting to cut down the salt. People are after the sodium, potassium salts and all these things. Cutting down the salt is going to decrease the blood pressure by 5 millimeters of mercury, but in case somebody is taking not a good diet, then the blood pressure control cannot be undone even by the good exercise. So the diet is the most important thing, and if a proper diet is taken, then it is going to bring down the blood pressure by say 12 by 6 millimeters of mercury, which is one of the most important parameters, lifestyle modification parameters to bring down the blood pressure or diabetic control. And next on, coming on to the smoking cessation, which also has an effect in controlling blood pressure and diabetes both, and alcohol cessation, those especially the alcohol containment. It is important those patients of hypertension who want to take alcohol, they should stop taking alcohol, particularly soda, because soda has a lot of sodium in it. And if they continue to take it with water, then it is not going to be that harmful as it is going to be with soda. So this point should be always emphasized, and then cutting down to the salt. Dr. Kunal, what is the role of statins in the hypertension, in the diabetes? And Dr. Makhija, I'm also going to ask you the same question. Should the patients with hypertension be given statins? Over to Dr. Kunal. What is the role of statins in the...
Sir, definitely. I think Dr. Makhija already pointed out diabetes is a cardiovascular equivalent. They all deserve to have statin unless they are very young and have no risk factors. But we have to look at the LDL before we refuse anybody a statin. In case they do meet their target, maybe you can delay the statin for few years. But I think almost most of them would require statins. Sooner or later, we cannot let go of statin. Statin has to be there. Targets both by this ASC and ESC, both have very clearly defined targets for LDL.
Dr. Makhija, what about your patients with hypertension? Do you like to give them statins?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, see, the hypertension, as such, if it's a isolated hypertension without any risk factor, without evidence of any hypertension-mediated organ damage, then probably the general guidelines will apply. However, if the patient has associated comorbidities, then of course they tend to get the preference. Maybe, in my opinion, if the patient is hypertensive and diabetic, most of them will require statin invariably. and any evidence of CAD, CVD, again statins. But for a pure hypertensive who is well controlled, and then the primary primary prevention guidelines, what they suggest, those have to be taken into account.
If a patient of hypertension is having hyperlipidemia or dyslipidemia, would like to add on to statins?
Of course, if the patient has dyslipidemia, then he qualifies for a statin. What I'm trying to say is that hypertension alone, probably without any evidence of any organ damage or risk factors, will not qualify for a statin. But if he has dyslipidemia, then of course he gets a statin.
That's great. And one last question which I'm going to put to Dr. Kunal is that what are the contraindications? You have told great about the indications, but a physician should be aware what are the contraindications, and one may end up in legal trouble in case somebody uses the drug, especially the metformin in the advanced renal failure, and metformin in the advanced cardiac failure, and the SGLT2 inhibitors in the renal disease. And what are the other precautions that one physician should take while using any of these drugs?
Yeah, sir, obviously all the drugs have their own contraindications. Specifically metformin, if the patient is sick for any reason, he is vomiting, he has gastrointestinal symptoms, he should not take it. If he is having worsening kidney disease, he should not take it. If his creatinine is already elevated, it is a very bad time to introduce metformin. Somebody who is already taking it, you may take it up to at a level of serum creatinine of 3. SGLT2, again you have to look at a number of things before you add SGLT2. Patient should not be having a recurrent UTI or genital mycotic infections. Even though there are a lot of data coming up with lower GFR, but still it is not as yet approved for GFR below 60 and below 45. So SGLT2 have to be careful. Again, it is not a drug to be given in a person who is insulin deficient or who is hypovolemic.
Yes.
So you can push a patient into non-ketotic, non-hyperglycemic ketosis, and again
euglycemic
ketosis. And this is not a drug to be given again in patients who have already got a bone disease. It may increase fractures. Same is true with pioglitazone, glitazone. You have to look for bone strength. You have to see the patient should not be in cardiac failure, and you need to avoid weight gain. So pioglitazone is not a good drug. Sulfonylurea are usually safe, but the greatest drawback is hypoglycemia. Newer sulfonylurea, the second generation, are way better than the older ones. Still, we have to be a little careful, especially in the elderly or cardiac patients, about hypoglycemia. And same issues with insulin. Overall, they are a very safe drug, but insulin you should totally avoid in a patient you cannot manage hypoglycemia at home. And even if you need to give insulin, you need to give very relaxed targets for sugar control. GLP-1 is more of a tolerability rather than a contraindication. But somebody who is not tolerating it, it is not wise to give GLP-1. Again, a patient who is vomiting and who's already quite, who has a good weight and is losing weight, again not a good drug to give GLP-1. Except insulin and in some cases metformin, most of the drugs are not supposed to be given in pregnancy. And DPP-4 are generally safe. DPP-4, other than patient having history of pancreatitis, you can give to all the patients with any comorbidity. Most of the renal disease patients can tolerate DPP-4, except linagliptin and teneligliptin. You need to adjust the dose. In linagliptin and teneligliptin, you can give the same dose you can continue even in end-stage renal disease. So I think those few points that we have to look before prescribing a drug.
That's very nice. Thank you very much, both the speakers. And I hand over the mic to the Alchem Group, Mr. Arun Jain. Thank you, Arun, for inviting all of us. And over to you now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to all of you for the wonderful session. On behalf of entire Alchem, all the audiences, I take the opportunity to thank Dr. S.K. Gupta for moderating the webinar and ensuring the audiences are enriched with the clinically relevant messages. We also thank Dr. Aman Makhija and Dr. Kunal Gupta for sharing their clinical experiences. We also thank you all the doctors who have joined this webinar. We at LKM will continue to serve doctors and patients by making our brands available and good quality. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.